For over 20 years, the Centre for Social Justice has been listening to the voices that matter most, the small charities on the front line. Many of the policies we've taken into government in that time have started not in this office or in Parliament, but as recurring themes we've heard from our CSJ Alliance partners, who are experts by experience. On average, we visit 2 charities a day, but we want to go further. That's why we're launching this podcast series led by the voices of small charities. I'm Andy Cook, Chief Executive of the Centre for Social Justice, and today I'm joined by Ed Davies, Research Director, Mercy Maroki, Development Director, and Joe Shallam, Policy Director, otherwise known as the Three Amigos. Kicking off this series is a CSJ Alliance charity in Darlington called Parents and Children Together North East, run by Trevor and Pam Birtle. So over to you, Trevor and Pam.
Hello, my name's Pam Birtle.
And my name is Trevor Birtle, and Pam and I together are founders of Parent and Child Together North East, which is a supported housing charity on the outskirts of Darlington in the North East. We've been supporting families here for around 10 years, and we support people and house them in log cabins on a lovely 4-acre site.
Our conversation today is about the issue of fatherlessness. It's a complicated issue, but what we are aware of is that the impact of not having a 2-parent family, of not having fathers who are actively participating in the rearing of their children, that it actually has a massive impact on their growing up. And I guess what we want to talk about is how can the government, how can society, how can the education department help to encourage young people to think about seriously that commitment and what does it mean, because it gives the best outcomes for them.
Okay, thank you, Trevor and Pam, for that beast of a question to kick off this series. I'm going to start with you, Eduardo. I take this back. They're saying that it's about parents parenting, but what the deeper context is that fatherlessness is the biggest issue going on right now. Do you agree with that as an overview?
Yes.
Could you say a bit more?
So when it's really interesting, this is like Pam and Trevor could be any one of hundreds of organisations that we speak to that say exactly the same thing, that this is one of the big things. And I suppose the thing I would possibly say that's slightly different is it's definitely the biggest thing we're not talking about in Westminster. So there are lots of crises that Westminster will talk about, climate crises or job crises or things like that. And we're all focused on how do we get more people in work? How do we have lower carbon emissions? But we are not focused on how do we get more fathers in their children's lives. And I think that is why it's becoming a crisis, because it's a sort of unspoken one.
So is this about, you just said about fathers not being children's lives or fathers being alongside mothers? Because they mentioned on there about a kind of, whatever they called it, a 2-parent family.
Yeah.
What you said is quite different. Fathers being in lives is different, perhaps, to fathers being alongside mothers in a relationship.
Yeah. So I would say that being a husband is an essential part of being a father. And that's even harder to talk about than being a father. But ultimately, you earn the right to be as present as possible in your child's life by being in a good relationship with the child's mother. And it's one of those situations where there are an awful lot of shades of grey, from completely absent to a bit absent to what have you. So it's hard to sort of pinpoint what, but more is more. And you are more likely to be more present if you're in a good relationship with the child's mother. So I think you're right to raise that difference. And it does matter that actually being a good husband is one of the key parts of being a good father, because you can be more present.
Joe, you run the policy setup here. Do you agree with what Ed's just said there?
I do. I mean, I think it's striking how difficult it is to have a conversation in policy affairs about family at all, let alone fathers. And I think that, for good reason, it's quite easy for politicians to slip into a kind of moral hectoring tone, particularly where they have, quite checkered marital histories of their own. To start, beginning to talk about family from a sort of policy perspective is quite hard. But I do think we've got a lot worse at this, actually, as a society and in our sort of politics over the last 10 years. And I read out this quote. I'd love to know if people can guess who this, as it was at the time, a sort of budding MP who said this. So they said that my leader should pledge to make Britain the most father-friendly nation in the world. We need a family policy that's fit for the 21st century, and we need a language of love and respect with which to frame it. Without this, it won't just be the ex party that loses out. It will be the next generation of children who grow up without a father figure in their lives. Can anyone tell me who that MP was?
Can you give us a vague date?
So early 2010s.
Oh, was it David Lammy?
Got it. Yeah, got it. Absolutely right. And I just think it's really striking that, this isn't something that was completely alien to the Labour left, even to be talking about some 10, 12 years ago. But it's very rare that you hear about it now from politicians.
Go on.
Tony Blair used to give speeches on marriage in a way that you would never hear now. And that difference, as you say, over the last 15 years, is just night and day.
Something that's niggling at me though, and Mercy, I'm interested in your comment that you've said, Ed, right from the off. We've gone punchy right from the start. You've basically said that you're a better father if you are in a relationship with the mother still.
You're unable to be more present, yeah.
Okay, so in what you're talking about, because I'm trying to separate here, father, being a dad, of which we've all got friends that might be with the partner or might not be, and being a kind of two-parent family, if that makes sense. But you're saying you're stronger if you're in a two-parent family.
So I'm saying, yeah, so effectively, one of the key things about being a parent is showing up, is being present. And there are, as I say, there's 100 degrees of how you can do that. But if you're in a good relationship with your partner, you're unable to be more present. But the second part of it is, I think we've reduced parenting to teaching, and actually mostly it's role modeling. And at the heart of an awful lot of this, the reason we want great fathers is because we want men and women to get along together, basically. Like the ultimate goal of this is we all get on. And if you are role modeling that relationship day in, day out, year on end, that this is what being a good husband and father looks like, I think that's so much more powerful than, so much of what we have now in policy is sort of, let's give kids an hour's lesson on how to be respectful and give consent. No, if you watch every single day for 18 years what being respectful looks like towards a woman, then you'll learn what it's like.
Okay. Mercy, do you agree with what's been said here? That A, we've got a chronic problem with fatherlessness in this country, and B, you're slightly better at it if you stay with your missus.
I do think that there can be like an element of naivety or ignorance to some extent about why some women, some mothers don't want the father for their child in their child's life. And so when we're talking about it's great to have Father's Day and let's encourage more fathers to be in their children's lives, there's almost an assumption that that's going to necessarily be a net benefit to the relationship, to the family, to the child. And I think a lot of, especially the sort of people we kind of work for, the sort of bottom 20%, they're having these relationships that are full of abuse, full of addiction. They're experiencing lots of issues that are the reason they broke up in the first place, that are often in toxic relationships. And one of our Alliance charities, I think that one last year, was helping women who have been in really toxic abusive relationships. And so I think, given that children growing up in those sorts of families are almost the ones who are going to benefit the most from having positive role models because they haven't had that good start in life, what do you do when actually the man involved that you want to be in that child's life is probably not going to be necessarily a positive influence, and is probably going to even have a more toxic relationship by bringing himself back into the picture? I think that's what we sometimes...
Yeah, well, let me put that back to you. Ed, are you naive? Is this Is this a middle class view that actually, if you have the dad around, because on the whole he might be working, he might be half decent, might have got an education, he's better being involved, versus those at the bottom end? I remember when I ran my charity, half the lads that you knew had parents there you knew were struggling big time, and the question is, are they better in their child's life for their child?
Yeah. So I think what we do is we probably get into the specific really quickly on this subject because it's really personal. So I want to talk about a population level. The reality is half the 16-year-old boys in this country pretty much don't live with their fathers now. So we're not talking this about being difficult fathers or abusive relationships. We're talking about this being absolute normality now. When you look at abusive relationships, things like that, of course we need to get out of those. Of course, no one's saying stay in those, but they are a very small percentage. And I think there is also a second part to this where actually the risk of abusive, bad parenting, etc., increases with a non-biological man in the house. So if you're not related to the child, you are more likely to be abusive. Now, again, population level, there are some fantastic step parents, brilliant step parents. But at a national level, that cycle of boyfriends in the house can become more damaging as well. So there is a sort of reality, absolutely, of individual families that we have to be honest about. But when you're looking at a national level, it's a really bleak picture.
But what about the grey area where, okay, maybe the person's not actually physically abusive necessarily, or I just think that a lot of, because we don't teach young men how to father, how to engage in a child's life, maybe them being in their child's life, they'll just put them in front of an iPad or just ignore them. That's also perhaps sometimes why relationships, especially maybe younger women who accidentally get pregnant with men, maybe they don't really want that. So what I think sometimes before we say we really want to bring fathers in, there's a separate question before that, which is, what are we doing to make sure that as many young men as possible are actually equipped with the emotional intelligence to be a positive influence on their child?
Yeah, well, I guess you're going to the point that critics to some of the kind of this framing, this narrative, this evidence, if you like, would suggest that, you're saying, Ed and Joe, perhaps, that single mothers are lacking, therefore.
No, I think that's absolutely the wrong way to think about it, to frame it. I think single parents do a phenomenal job in pretty trying circumstances. I think, from a policy perspective, there's a question for me about, are we doing enough to support family across the board, but also to promote the types of families that we know, in terms of the outcomes, are positive. And that doesn't have to be a kind of either or for me. I think you can do both. And I think often in the discussion, it can, veer very quickly to the defensive, for good reason, because people have felt like they've been under attack. But actually, that's maybe come at the cost of promoting the positive. And so I think there is a need to sort of fill that gap. I do think, you've got to look at some of the consequences of not having filled that. And I think it's, 3 and 4 kids in custody without a father figure at home. We know that, kids are looking to other kind of role models. There is a vacuum that's being filled. And, figures like Andrew Tate and others are sort of, they're playing to a market that is out there, they know is out there. And surely we have to do something about that. The other challenge, of course, beyond the moral point is, is this really the number one problem facing the country? We've got public services that don't work. We've got an economy that's stagnating. But this is the kind of the hidden crisis among all of those things that I think really does touch on every challenge that the country is facing. I think £64 billion, is the cost of family breakdown has been calculated. But beyond that, think of all of the future workers, future carers, the people in our society that, don't exist because we haven't done enough as a society to really focus on building strong families that can produce children that are loving, stable environments, people to go grow up and thrive. So it is connected to those wider kind of economic arguments as well as the moral dimension.
And Mercy, you have worked in the heart of government. It's the power broker that you are. Why can the dots not be joined? Why are people in Westminster so either afraid to talk about it, or the dots aren't joined, so they just won't talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's because politicians like straightforward, easy, quick answers that they can implement within 5 years of, they're guaranteed to be there. And often it's not even 5 years because they're always chopping and changing who's in power. And I think with this, the data is very, very clear on why having two parent households, children growing up in them, the outcomes are better. That's unequivocal. But how do you get men, and it is men because most of these are single mothers, not all, but most of the households we're talking about will be single mother households. How do you then get the men back into the home? Or how do you get them back into their children's lives? And is it even is it even a politician's, government's role to kind of be implementing policies to do that? And I think that's what we haven't really been able to pin down, because it's an emotional question. Like it's a question of emotion and psychology rather than, money. You can't pay people to go back into their children's lives. You have to. It's a cultural question, really.
I think Hungary's trying to do that, aren't they? But but you're saying two different things there. So on the one hand, you're saying politicians want easy and quick answers. On the other, you're saying, is it even a politician's job? So which would you say it's a politician's job to try and maneuver this?
I think it's definitely the government. The government has to do something, because, as Joe says, this is not an isolated issue. It has fundamental impact on society and the economy and everything. But I think it's not the change will happen really on a cultural level, is my point. Because it has to almost be a organic cultural movement. And we're seeing, we know social movements can happen. Andrew Tate have led a huge cultural movement towards young men having one particular way of thinking. That's very clear that even one influencer can have such a profound impact on the way men view themselves. So I do think role models, we need something to come sort of from the ground to have the same kind of impact that Andrew Tate has had, but in a positive way.
Joe, asking the question why it doesn't shift, and Mercy gives a compelling answer there. When asked recently, Bridget Phillipson, Secretary of State for Education, was asked about family. She said, I'd just tread with a bit of care when making judgment around people's family and their circumstances. I was brought up by my mum on her own. I do recognise that family breakdown can have a serious impact on young people. It's why we're putting on support in post backing families. But I do think fundamentally it's people making decisions about family shape and size that's right for them. But I do tread with care when making judgments. You've also been in government at the very highest level, may I say. Why is it that politicians like Bridget are saying, I'm not making any judgment on that, I'll just pick up the pieces, or try to, if things break down?
I mean, I think she's right. I think we do have to tread with care. I don't think anyone should be making judgments actually about people's individual choices in that way. But I think, as I said earlier, you can look at the kind of national population level of this. We know that, your worst nightmare as a politician is to wake up or get the call that the next morning you're going to have you face some front page of the Daily Mail, particularly charges of hypocrisy being laid. But I think the things that the things that can sort of galvanise politicians to talk about difficult issues or areas where they feel like they'll be challenged is like a crisis or a crystallising moment. And we saw in 2011 after the riots, David Cameron came out and made a speech. I think he spoke about the problem of a lack of young male of role models, male role models for young men. And I do wonder what will be the equivalent crisis or crystallizing moment that creates the space for politicians to speak into this area. Is it the documentary? There's a Freudian, is that the fictional program Adolescence has obviously galvanized a huge amount of conversation or did about this, about online influencers and the impact on young men, and that really did well. So you do wonder, is there a kind of an equivalent cultural moment?
But for piecing together what you guys have said, which is asking why politicians don't go after this. On the one hand, they want the quick answers, and this isn't one of those. This is generational shift, it's cultural shift. Secondly, they're scared of having their face smashed on the Daily Mail because, quite frankly, of hypocrisy. They're saying one thing and maybe kind of doing something dodgy in the background. Ed, are those the only two factors that politicians won't do it, or do you think there's anything else?
Well, so I think there's something fascinating coming out of those two. I think it is a cultural thing. And I think we are, so is there going to be a crisis moment? I actually think we're living through it. And I think just this week we heard Nigel Farage talking about incentivizing marriage, a man who himself is twice divorced, was very open about it. And I think what we are seeing in this entire political earthquake we're seeing across most of the Western world at the moment is people saying, hang on, something about the status quo is not working and I'm going to try something else. Now, I don't think they would necessarily equate that to marriage or fathers or anything else. But what they are realizing is the state can no longer cope with what it's being given by society. We can't pay enough to the schools to cope with the sick children that are coming through. We can't deal with what's coming into the NHS every day. And so what they're saying is we have to try something else. And I think it is a big, slow, as you say, a cultural change, a massive shift. But I think we're starting to see it happen. And I think the fact that a politician leading in the polls has come out in the last week and said, we need to incentivize marriage, despite the fact I've been divorced twice, is a massive moment. And then just the last point on that, the way you get away from it being moralizing is having a guy saying, I've been divorced twice, but I'm looking at the numbers and they matter. And I think that's really important, to have someone who is not painting themselves squeaky clean. They're not coming out with their perfect manicured life and 2.4 children in front of the cameras and saying, live like me. They're saying the numbers are really clear here. If we don't get a grip on this, we're in big trouble.
Okay, and you guys have both mentioned, I'm pointing for those that aren't seeing it, Mercy and Joe, the Mr. Tate and all he's done. Do you think he is a direct result of this backing for fathers? Or do you think he's a creator of the vacuum? I'll go to you first, Mercy.
I actually think he's been taken less and less serious, and part of that has to do, I suppose, with the fact he has now been charged with very serious crimes that he has allegedly done. So I think, people are taking him, young people are taking him less serious, but I do think it goes to show really what the power that an individual can have. And actually, I think Nigel Farage has become incredibly popular amongst younger men. And, if his message is one of, actually, guys, it matters to be in, stable relationships. Families matter, and I'm going to give tax breaks to families because of how much they matter to society. I think that's a positive message. I'm not suggesting, Nigel Farage is suddenly going to be, the new role model for young men everywhere. But I just do think we need more people in leadership positions, more celebrities talking about this stuff. I actually think there's lots that can be achieved for young people.
I think that there's a real hunger for this stuff as well. And it's really interesting. You look at some of the things that have done well in culture in recent years, and they have had these fantastic father figures in them. So what do you think the most downloaded program was in the world last year? Any ideas?
Was it Leeds United's championship?
Close.
Oh God, I don't know. White Lotus?
No. So it's a kid's cartoon.
Oh, right.
Bluey. So Bluey is the most downloaded thing. And Bluey basically charts this fantastic dad and how he engages with his kids. And the kids love it and the parents love it. You can hear parents of young kids literally weep over this stuff. It's a wonderful example. And there's a hunger for it. And people are watching it and going, do you know what? That hits. What about the most watched program in the UK last year?
Granger?
Traitors, I would have thought.
Single episode, sorry. Is this
Single episodes.
Christmas special?
Oh, Gavin and Stacey.
Gavin and Stacey. The denouement of Gavin and Stacey is this moment when he's about to get married to the wrong girl, and they stand up one by one. But they're all looking for the dad character, played by Larry Lamb, who plays Gavin's dad, and everyone is waiting for him to stand up. And what you realise is for the last 20 years, the central character has not been Gavin or Stacey or any of their mates. It's been this guy that's held it all together, and it's like Larry Lamb saved Christmas. But you see these examples in culture of strong fathers and strong men who are looking after their families, and you're naturally drawn to them, which again comes back to, I think we're at a turning point. I think suddenly people want to watch Bluey. They want to see Gavin's dad stand up. And I think that's quite exciting.
So I love the analogy of Larry Lamb as kind of the saviour waiting in the wings for...
It'll be on the front cover of your next policy report, no doubt.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone around on some quite punchy topics, but to come back and try and answer Trevor and Pam's initial question, how, though, do we change this through policy? I get that this might be a long-term game, but what is it that could start happening now that might make our conversation in this way in 5 years that little bit more positive, beyond the fact that Bluey's just got a load of downloads, but actually what could happen now to help bring about more fathers, better men, and all the rest that comes with it? Any ideas? I'll start with you, Ed.
So I think to the point that this is a cultural shift, I think politicians have to realise that it is cultural, not political, but they are part of culture. And as doing that, I think it's great that Nigel Farage was talking about how you incentivise people and encourage them in their stable families. But that's never going to be enough. The tax break's not going to be enough. We need to do about 100 things all at once. And some of that will be in the tax system, some in the benefit system. There are small things you can do, addressing antenatal letters to dads. Can you do antenatal classes for dads? Are we rolling out family hubs properly? Are we involving men in family hubs? There's one in Camden that has a brilliant dad section. Are we doing that more widely? Are we spreading best practice? So I think where it comes to is the government has to recognise there's not one thing that's going to shift the dial. But if we do 100 things at once and we watch Bluey on telly, then we can shift culture.
Joe?
I mean, I do think that the tax point, it's small, but, it can seem small, and I appreciate we need to do a lot of things. But I think in terms of the wiring of the state, so many big policy questions end up being answered by, can the computers make it happen? The Whitehall. And actually, our tax system is quite weird. It's very individualized, and a large sort of extent of that is because the computers in HMRC look at individuals. And the last Tory government began trying to rewire it such that it was able to look at households in the round. It's a huge job. And so I think it was helpful that Reform and Farage personally sort of began that conversation of, can we begin to rewire the tax system such that it is looking at family and recognizing the joint role that it takes to raise children. I think we need to press on with that as a priority.
Just to ask you a follow-up on that, do you think it was helpful that Farage has talked about this? Because as many he turns on to stuff, he turns off to stuff. And so could this create a kickback to lump this thing in with a load of Farage's other stuff?
Well, I mean, I guess a large part of that question depends on whether you think, Reform are likely to win the next general election. They're currently top of the polls. There's a long way for them to go. Yes, it may be the case that the spillover effect is, an association with other policy areas, from migration to their fiscal plans more broadly. But I can't see it as anything but a positive thing for the overall question of the importance of families, particularly on our tax system, for the idea itself to be out there and being debated. I think that is overwhelmingly a good thing.
Okay, so we've got from Ed, antenatal classes and 100 other, I would say, probably small but important ideas. We've got rewiring of the tax system. Mercy, what would you do if you could do any policies right now to change the dial?
I would heavily regulate children's access to social media and to apps in general. And the reason I say that is because I do really think that access to social media, particularly for children sort of hitting their puberty years, when they're confused, they're trying to figure out who they are, trying to attach themselves to an identity, it makes them really prone to kind of attaching themselves to really skewed, warped masculine figures of masculinity, or self-proclaimed representatives of masculinity. And there's also the sort of access to porn as well. I don't think we do nearly enough to sort of regulate that for children. There's lots of things that are skewing young boys' understanding of what a relationship looks like, what healthy interactions between young men and young women look like. And I really think a lot of them stem from the fact they have unbridled access to the internet and to social media. And I think really that's where you start the cultural change. A politician in Westminster is not going to kind of trigger cultural change. But I do think if you go to the root of the problem, which is social media, you can start having an impact early on in boys' early years when it comes to relationships.
So you have social media change, you've got tax change, or we've got 100 small cuts on policy delivery change. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you to Pam and to Trevor for their question. If you have any questions, please phone them in to a switchboard that is lighting up as we finish this podcast, and we will endeavour to answer and discuss it on our next episode. Thanks for listening.